In the late 1970s, Fall River, Massachusetts found itself at the heart of a troubling string of murders. At first glance, the victims appeared to share no commonalities. However, as the investigation progressed, authorities revealed links to sex work, cult involvement, and allegations of satanic rituals. This case would result in numerous arrests, raise concerns regarding mental health and manipulation, and spark a continuous discussion about the true events that transpired. So they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons, after whom they whore. Leviticus 17:7. Fall River, Massachusetts once thrived as one of the nation's leading textile manufacturing cities. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Fall River was one of the most important manufacturing centers in the United States. Often referred to as the Spindle City, it was home to dozens of mills powered by the nearby Ques River, whose cascading falls gave the city its name, Fall River. At its peak, Fall River had more cotton textile mills than any other city in the world. The city's textile industry drove innovation and economic development. It attracted entrepreneurs and skilled laborers and became a symbol of American industrial strength. Fall River produced textiles were shipped across the country and around the world. Fall River flourished architecturally during its boom. The city boasts beautiful Victorian homes, granite mills, and civic buildings. Landmarks like the Fall River Historical Society, Battleship Cove, and the Lizzie Borden House reflect its deep historical roots. Situated on Mount Hope Bay, Fall River also had a vibrant shipping and fishing industry. It was once an important port for steamship travel between Boston and New York. The Fall River Line, a luxury steamship service, was framed in the 19th century for its elegance and reliability. But by the mid-20th century, the industry had largely collapsed, leaving behind vacant mills, economic hardship, and a city struggling with identity and poverty. And by the 1970s, the effects were visible. Unemployment rates were high, especially among young people. Crime rates were rising, including drug activity and prostitution. Many neighborhoods, particularly around the old industrial districts, had become neglected and unsafe. There was also a growing presence of youth drawn into fringe beliefs, alternative regions, or occult symbolism, often as a form of rebellion or identity seeking in an environment where hope and opportunity were hard to find. While most of these interests were harmless, the social and economic instability made Fall River a place where vulnerable individuals could fall through the cracks. It was during this period that a small group of people, tied together by drugs, sex work, and self-styled occult beliefs, came into focus. And it was in this environment, not just physically run down, but emotionally and culturally fractured, that the first body was discovered. On the morning of October 13th, 1979, the body of a young woman was found under the bleachers of Diamond High School in Fall River. A group of local schoolboys had come across her body around 8 a.m. and quickly notified the authorities. When police arrived, they found the victim partially clothed, with her hands bound behind her back with fishing line. She had been brutally beaten and stabbed multiple times in the head. There were clear signs of overkill, which suggested extreme rage or that the victim and killer possibly knew each other. Investigators noted that the position of the body and the bindings appeared deliberate. The way that the body was bound, it was basically impossible for her to do this to herself. There were also small burns and cuts that had led some to speculate torture or a symbolic motive, but again, no clear evidence pointed to anything concrete just yet. The woman was soon identified as 17-year-old Doreen Levesque, and she had been living in nearby New Bedford and was known to have been involved in sex work. Before she met her demise, Doreen Levesque was a teenager navigating a life full of instability. Born in 1962, she had grown up in and around the New Bedford and Fall River area, a region already struggling with poverty and social fragmentation. From a young age, Doreen's home life was marked by dysfunction. While many details about her early years remain private or undocumented, what is known is that she was placed in the foster care system as a minor. Whether due to neglect, abuse, or general family hardship, she became one of many children shoveled through Massachusetts' overburdened child welfare systems during the 1970s. By all accounts, Doreen did not receive the consistent support or protection that the system was supposed to provide. She bounced between foster homes and eventually began running away, falling in with people who offered a false sense of belonging, often in exchange for survival through sex work or drug activity. At just 17, Doreen was living away from any stable home, working the streets, and trying to survive in one of the toughest environments a teenager could face. She wasn't enrolled in school, and no one in an official capacity was actively looking out for her safety. So when her body was discovered that October morning, it was the first time that many people, including the public and the press, had ever even heard her name. Her death would be the spark that ignited an investigation, but it also presented something deeper: a failure of a system meant to protect children just like her. In the first few days after the body was found, police questioned known sex workers in the area and began compiling a list of frequent clients, possible pimps, and individuals involved in drug activity, but no arrests were made and no clear suspects emerged. At first, Doreen Levesque's murder seemed like an isolated act of violence, tragic, brutal, and heartbreaking, but not necessarily connected to anything larger. But behind the scenes, investigators were already sensing that something about the crime scene didn't quite fit the usual pattern. The restraints, the location, the level of violence, it all hinted at something more. And within months, another body would surface, and then another. And then that's when Fall River Police Department realized they weren't dealing with a single homicide. They were looking at a pattern, and possibly a serial killer. Only a few weeks after the discovery of Doreen, Fall River's police were called to another grim scene in November of 1979. The body of Barbara Raposa, a woman in her early 20s, was found in a wooded area near the city's outskirts, an area known for being isolated. Barbara's body was discovered by a local hiker who immediately alerted authorities. Upon arrival, investigators noted that her body showed clear signs of a violent assault. She had been strangled with ligature marks evident around her neck and had sustained blunt force trauma to the head. The positioning of the body suggested an attempt to conceal it, though the location was still close enough to populated areas that the authorities were concerned about a possible serial offender. Barbara was identified by a local dentist through her dental records shortly after her death. Now, Barbara's background was similar to Doreen's in many ways. She had struggled with instability and was known to be involved in sex work. Friends and acquaintances described Barbara as someone who had faced numerous hardships growing up, including family issues and economic difficulties. She was often seen in the same circles as others on the fringe of society, vulnerable to exploitation and violence. Police began to notice the patterns here. Now, both victims were young women connected to sex work, living on the margins of society, and suffering extreme violence. This raised massive concerns that these were not isolated incidents, but possibly linked murders. Despite the similarities, investigators faced many difficulties. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, either out of fear or distrust of law enforcement. The underground nature of the victim's lifestyle made it challenging to piece together solid leads. Barbara's murder deepened the urgency for Fall River police. The community was growing increasingly fearful, and the media began to focus more attention on these cases, though, tragically, the victims themselves remained largely forgotten by society until their deaths. The discovery of Barbara Raposa's body marked a turning point for the Fall River Police Department. Authorities intensified their efforts. They put together a task force, re-examined evidence from both crime scenes, and began canvassing the neighborhoods where the victims had been known to work. Officers interviewed friends, acquaintances, and known associates, hoping to find any connection between the victims or clues that could lead to a suspect. However, the investigation faced significant challenges. They were finding more witnesses that were reluctant to talk because of drug use and prostitution. There was a notable distrust of law enforcement with some of these communities, which made gathering all of this information super difficult. Forensic technology was limited by today's standards, and many pieces of physical evidence could not be conclusively linked to any suspect. But despite these difficulties, police publicly stated their commitment to solving the murders and urged anyone with information to come forward. The residents of Fall River were shaken and rightfully terrified. Local newspapers began running stories about the murders, focusing on the brutal nature of the crimes and the increasing fear among sex workers and other vulnerable groups. Yet, public sympathy was complicated by stigma around the victims' lifestyles, which unfortunately affected how much attention and resources were devoted to the cases. Different groups and some community members began calling for better protection and support for at-risk women, highlighting how social neglect and economic hardship were contributing factors to the violence. But many felt that the city was slow to respond meaningfully. In the weeks that followed, there was a mixture of anxiety and anger, fear for personal safety, frustration with law enforcement's limited progress, and grief over the lives lost. But the rampage wouldn't end there, because on February 8, 1980, the case took another disturbing turn, when a local teenager taking a walk found parts of a human skull in the woods near Westport, Massachusetts, just outside of Fall River. Investigators later confirmed through dental records that the remains belonged to 20-year-old Karen Marsden, a local woman who had been missing for almost 2 months. Unlike the previous victim, Karen's death wasn't initially treated as a simple murder. In fact, her disappearance was already on police radar because she had been interviewed just weeks earlier by the same detectives who were investigating the murders of Doreen and Barbara. Karen had been loosely associated with both women and also shared the same lifestyle. Karen had reportedly expressed fear for her life in the weeks before she vanished. Some accounts claim she had told others she knew who was responsible for the murders of Doreen and Barbara, and that she was terrified of becoming the next victim. Her remains were not found intact, only a portion of her skull and several teeth were recovered. Investigators believed her body had been dismembered and possibly subjected to ritualistic mutilation. Because so little of Karen's body was ever recovered, an official cause of death couldn't be confirmed through a traditional autopsy. However, statements from those involved painted a very chilling picture. And the only person to ever provide a detailed account of what happened to Karen Marsden was a 17-year-old girl named Robin Murphy, Karen's girlfriend. According to Robin, Karen was murdered during a satanic ritual in the remote Freetown Fall River State Forest. In chilling statements to police, she claimed Karen was brutally beaten, had her hair torn out, fingers broken, and was ultimately beheaded before her head was then drop-kicked like a soccer ball. At first, she claimed this was all orchestrated by a man named Carl Drew, a local pimp and self-proclaimed Satanist, and by his accomplice, Carl Davis. Carl Drew was a 26-year-old pimp operating in Fall River during the late 1970s. He had a reputation for being violent, controlling, and deeply feared by the young women who worked for him. Drew came from a troubled background, growing up in an abusive household and spending much of his youth in juvenile detention facilities and later prison. By the time the murders began, he was heavily involved in Fall River's sex trade and had established a small group of followers, many of them young, vulnerable women, who allegedly saw him as both a protector and a spiritual figure. Robin Murphy would later describe Drew as a Satanist who led his followers in rituals involving animal sacrifices, bloodletting, and threats of death to those who disobeyed him. According to her, Drew used these occult performances to instill fear and loyalty. He was accused of orchestrating Karen Marsden's murder, forcing others, including Robin, to take part in the act as a part of a satanic ceremony in the Freetown Fall River State Forest. Drew denied all allegations and insisted he was being framed, pointing to Robin's shifting statements and lack of physical evidence. Despite this, he was convicted of first-degree murder in 1981 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Over the years, Drew has maintained his innocence, and several people, including some law enforcement officers even, have raised questions about the legitimacy of his conviction. Carl Davis was another local pimp and enforcer who worked alongside Drew and moved in the same circles of drugs, sex work, and street violence. Less is publicly known about Davis compared to Drew, but he was implicated in the murder of Karen Marsden as well. Robin Murphy claimed that he was present during the ritual and played a role in the assault that led to Karen's death. Unlike Drew, Davis took a plea deal, and he pled guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a reduced sentence, avoiding a full trial. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. His decision to plead guilty removed the possibility of a cross-examination, and some critics of the case argued that the lack of a trial for Davis meant that there was less public scrutiny of the evidence against him. Robin alleged that she was forced to participate in the killing to bind her to silence, a sort of ritualistic initiation. These graphic claims, which lacked physical evidence beyond the partial skull and some teeth, became the backbone of the prosecution's case. Yet, over time, Robin's role grew more complicated. She later recanted portions of her testimony, at times implying she had lied or exaggerated key facts to protect herself. In other statements, she even hinted at a more direct role in Karen's death, stating that she had cut Karen's throat and had mutilated her body. Despite any inconsistencies, Robin was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Her credibility would remain one of the most contentious aspects of the case, with many questioning whether she was a manipulated witness, a vulnerable teen coerced by fear, or someone far more involved than she initially let on. The Fall River murders remain one of the most disturbing and controversial criminal cases in Massachusetts history, not just because of the violence, but because of what they revealed about a community in crisis. At the center of it were all young women, Doreen, Barbara, and Karen, who lived on society's cracks, vulnerable to exploitation, addiction, and neglect. Their deaths were not only the result of individual cruelty, but also of systemic failure, a city grappling with poverty and decay, institutions that didn't or couldn't protect its most at risk, and a climate of fear that allowed rumor and panic to shape justice. Even decades later, questions remain. Was Carl Drew truly the orchestrator of a satanic cult, or was he a convenient villain in a story the public was already primed to believe? Was Robin Murphy a terrified teenage witness, or a cunning manipulator protecting her own secrets? With shifting testimonies, minimal physical evidence, and lingering doubt over the true motives behind these crimes, the Fall River case leaves us with more questions than answers. But at the heart of this story are the victims, women who should never be forgotten. Their lives mattered before the headlines. And the actual truth, whatever it may be, has yet to be completely uncovered.